Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for May of 2025. I have 10 new albums that I spun over the last month that I'll be talking about in this video, with as always time codes listed in the description if you would like to skip around to each individual review. May was a dense month full of releases that I was excited for, and I got a lot of those out of the way with a couple of catch-ups and requests also strewn throughout. Give it a like if you're excited, and let's go ahead and start diving in by beginning with... While I wasn't big on the full Ouroboros of self-awareness that Pup reach on their last record, as much as the more overt direct bleakness and frustrations on an album like Morbid Stuff, I didn't want to count them out. And when they finally dropped their follow-up, Who Will Look After the Dogs, I was very curious to see if they were gonna bounce back or just further down their ironic spiral. I'm happy to say that I think that this is a step above that last album, and I think that while it's still very bold and brash, I think that it's more in service of helping the emotional core that strikes throughout this record reach a more grounded, interpersonal point. This album doesn't feel like it's diving more into a self-indulgent excursion and more feels like a purging of emotion. The album itself is a breakup album, and all of that honesty feels more enriched by the pounding drums and loud production that coats a lot of this. It both helps enrich that anger purged on tracks like Paranoid and Concrete, while also enhancing what gives way after that anger purged and some of the inner conflict seen throughout a track like Falling Out of Love or exploring the past with a new set of eyes in Hallways, all the while still packing strong hooks to carry the listener through this series of emotions in a solid splendor. I also really enjoy the collaboration with Jeff Rosenstock. I think he's been on a hell of a run, and I think anytime he crops up, it enriches a project at least a notch or so. I also do appreciate the moments where the band does step away from that throttling kineticism to take the listener out, whether it be in the ballad-esque Hunger for Deck that has its own explosion in the end, or the point where that inner conflict turns into a sullen crawl on the bass-led Best Revenge. This record front to back is a really, really strong pop-punk album, and as far as being a step back in the direction that I was hoping to see the band take, this absolutely is that. I think that this is a pretty damn good release, if you ask me. I'm going to be giving this an 8 out of 10. I think that it's really, really strong, and I think that if you like Pup, but you didn't like the tone or mood that the last album was going towards, I feel like this very much could hook you back in as somebody who has at least liked the sounds this band has been cooking up throughout their discography.
When the river runs dry and the curtain is cold, how will I know if I can't see the bottom?
So you may be wondering, after hearing or seeing my previous things I've said about Sleep Token and where I put their last album on that proverbial year-end list, why I'm even talking about Even in Arcadia. I'm a certified Sleep Token non-enjoyer. It's because a buddy that I work with who talked to me about the band, and I had shared those thoughts with, told me to spin this new one. Give it a chance. Said I would. Walking away, still not an enjoyer. Didn't make a fan out of me. If anything, I feel like the band really tries to tease more of like what I was hoping to get out of the band, but then pair that with like worse versions of what they were doing on their last album in the vein of like the pop-focused stuff and the like. You know, while it has this incredible drop in the opener, Look to Windward, and I think that like that's a good example showcasing of like the non-metal production being at least like solidly done. I still think that it creates this like oil and water dichotomy that I just don't think sounds good together, and I think when paired with the other stuff that they're doing on here, especially the pop-focused stuff, it just, it leaves an even more sullen taste in my mouth. You know, I was wanting more of some of the drops on, like, Gethsemane, or on the opener, Look to Windward. I didn't want more tracks like Past Self, or Caramel. Caramel in particular, you know, feels like it's like this Shape of You-ass song with this guitar, you know, flourishing out that feels like it should have hit harder considering what this band really aims to try and do sometimes, but even they don't really, like, do anything in that vein on that song. I also think that, like, the pivoting on a track like Provider really taps into the core of, like, what lyrically, I just think it's kind of, like, not good. The way that, like, yeah, sure, other bands may have things of a similar ilk when it comes to, like, portrait painting, but, like, that paired with this, like, Uncanny Valley-ass vocal style because of the production, which I get why it's like that still. I just don't think it's a good look. You know, many bands do the anonymity thing and not do that, and I think sound better as a result. I just hate the way the vocals are produced with this band, and I don't like the approach. I really don't like the approach.
I get why they have an audience, I just don't find myself amongst them. You know, I get people digging the very hook-driven stuff on here. I'm honestly shocked they haven't taken off more over here. I don't really hear Sleep Token in the wild. And considering the cult fan base that they have, I feel like is still kind of growing in some ways. It's kind of wild they haven't broke through in that sort of way. Some of their pop stuff, I think, would go over well. I do think Provider and even Caramel would do decently. It's just shocking to not see it. But it's not my bag.
I think that the melding of, like, heavy guitars and, like, rattling trap hi-hats can sound better. I've heard it sound better, you know, through, like, a lot of noise rap groups and the like. I'm gonna give this, like, a 3. It's got some decent executions of ideas within a song, but there isn't a single song on here that I like in full. You know, I think if there's any artist that makes captivating pocket projects time and time again, it is Pink Pantheress. I'm a sucker for her blending of dance pop with a very nostalgic sheen. I think that she writes these really simple but effective, cute songs that have this emotional core that taps into that sort of cutesy adolescence, but finds ways to present it in a mature way. And on Fancy That, we still get more of that in ways that I just still can't get enough of. While it's still being pitched as a mixtape, it has the type of sheen I really loved about Heaven Knows, her debut album, as it were, a project that still kept that just very concise song style approach that she just continues to show in spades on here, with the sequencing that record had, where each track just kind of danced so well into each other. But with this album in particular, it feels like almost in service to the brief sort of narrative being talked about throughout the lyrics. You know, the album opens so immediately with this introduction of Pink and this guy that she's seemingly hooking up with, but the relationship they're in isn't one that, like, she's necessarily proud of. And throughout these 9 tracks in 20 minutes, each track sort of is a slice of her headspace throughout seemingly this short little relationship with them together. You know, I already talked about Illegal sort of feeling like the initial meeting and those initial flurries of, like, wow, this is something so exotic and sort of scandalous. And before going into immediately that internal struggle of Girl Like Me and Tonight, you know, the desire to be more than what this is seeming like on the surface, but still the giving into those desires on Tonight when thinking about how this person really makes you feel. I could see the argument being that, like, well, there isn't enough time to let those emotions sit with the listener, because even on the one real point of conflict, maybe Noises, before Nice to Meet You comes in and starts to already send this situation into the horizon, that sort of feels like the point of this project. It's supposed to be these fleeting feelings of a relationship that wasn't meant to be, and I think it's sort of the magic of what makes this record really fun to respin. You know, because dance music is meant to be this euphoric rush of energy, such as the sort of likes that I feel like would be felt during a relationship like this, you know? It's meant to be forbidden, but electric. And that electricity is felt throughout this. And I think that that's more important than any length of a project could be. Because I still really, really like this. I think that it's infinitely respinnable because of its length, but I think that the production, the dance grooves, all of that on this is still choice. It's still fan-fucking-tastic. And I think that if you like dance music, if you like concise pop music on top of that, here's your ticket, baby. This is an 8 out of 10. Fantastic release. I also would like it to be longer, but I think that in its current state, it's still fantastic. I think Billy Woods has been on an insane run since I got into him via Arm & Hammer, who has also been just on a wild run as a twosome. I know that there's rumors of them dropping another album with The Alchemist this year. I am gassed the fuck up about that. But the thing that I think is interesting about getting into Billy Woods via that has been the stretch of solo records he's dropped since that time. They've been very nichely conceptual in a way that I feel like is indicative of Billy's very vivid and nuanced bar spinning, but I think that the avenues he's channeled in those records via, like, traveling high as hell on weed on maps, or the absolute obtuseness with the ambiguity of Aethiops, he's just a really interesting rapper to hear rap. And I think that when he tackles a concept, even if it's very niche, he does so in a very captivating way. The same could be said for this new album. I think when it comes to melting pots and hip-hop, there are sometimes ones that come about that just really leave an impact. You know, last year, Heems's La Fondar was one that I really gassed up, but this one is one of a similar ilk. The sonic palette is just one of paranoia and darkness and madness. You know, this album is meant to be bold and very upfront, but I think that the avenues that he takes those ideas within the concept that this album lies within the title is what I think makes this album that notch better, that much more, like, well thought out. I absolutely love the immediacy that this album starts with. You know, while it takes its time and really delves into spacious atmospheres when it decides to, like, dissect from the world. You know, the fact that this album aptly starts with a jump scare, something to be as upfront as the imagery of the record itself. I think it does so splendorously. I think that that initial stretch really cements the listener in this world of darkness and paranoia after that as well. I really love the beat of Jump Scare. It's very much like the best kind of horrorcore adjacent stuff, but like the actual sound collage that is Star 87's beat is insane, and how that ties into the concept of, like, Star 87 calls and the like is fucking wild. That giving way to the sort of off-kilter, off-beat jazz of Misery and Black Christmas is a really good way to bring the listener down into, like, a world of reality, a tangible reality, you know, especially across the storytelling of Black Christmas. I think that Billy and Bruiser have this interesting dichotomy in their styles that pair really well together. The stretch of Preservation through Pitchforks and Halos, both instrumentally and lyrically, is insane. I love the minimalism of Counterclockwise, and it's a moment where that gets a little bit clean, but that bass just keeps it so fucking fuzzy and funky. It's such a minimal atmosphere that I think Billy still harnesses fucking masterfully. I also think that if LP's gonna be cooking more production, please do more with Billy Woods. Corinthians is a great pairing of Billy and Despot. Also, to see Despot still around in 2025 is sick as fuck. And a verse following to sort of deconstruct the usage of Corinthians is just a well-penned verse from Billy, and I think that Despot comes in and pairs well with that kind of like vintage Despot feel. It's a record that, diving through the lyrics, is one of a lot of fruitful insight into perspective, and I think is pulled together excellently, as always. I think, again, Billy Woods is just another one of those insanely consistent rappers that continues to excite me with each following release.
that biblical sort of energy being taken to more of like the core of the album's darkness on a song like Golgotha that sort of begins a stretch of some uneasy and horror direct sort of energy that sort of would be invoked from an opener like Jump Scare through like Cold Sweat, a very paranoid filled track with a, you know, hypnotic loop piano, and it's beat done by Ant, another really solid collaboration between those two that I think helps sort of bring the listener in to Black Zombie after that really smoothly too. I think that's a more directly like horror inspired jam, but I think also sticks the landing.
A Doll Full of Pins is one of the few points where the actual idea of the album comes into a little more of a literal sense, and I think it's an interesting sort of image and concept of this being a voodoo doll and the pain of it as that. It's actually a piece of a stretch of beauty on this album too. I think that it, following the minimalism of All These Worlds Are Ours, takes the listener outside of the madness for just a little bit, and I think that this stretch is what further sets this record over the edge for me as far as like absolute adoration. I think that this record is absolutely choice. It is up there for like one of the best I've spun all year personally. I think that as far as being an album experience in the realms of hip-hop, there isn't one, at least that I've heard, better than this year. I'm giving it a 9 out of 10.
Pouring on blacks on taxing them. Just a couple reparations that I factor in. We saw the Toyota Ethiopians, yeah, but I'm on, right?
Honestly, my Aminé reviews suck, but I really like 13 Months of Sunshine. I think that it does a good job at sort of like continuing to flower out his sonic palette. You know, I feel like he definitely took some inspiration from the Keitra Aminé project, a project that I really liked, but admittedly I don't return to in full as much as I did the year that it came out. I do think it still has some fantastic highlights, and I think that like the electronic and dance like focus that parts of this record take meld well with like the funk and other pop driven directions he takes his songwriting on. This album is one of vacation and fun, but it also takes moments to get insular and in ways that I think Aminé can do well amidst his sort of like braggadocio and swagger that he carries himself with. And I also think shines admirably on a lot of this. I love a good vacay. I think that Raspberry Kisses sits well in this sandwich of like self-reflection turned sensuality. I think the Arc de Triomphe is a fantastic sort of like other boast of energy through the last stretch of the record. But man, the electronic edge on this I think also just sounds really cool. The Toro Mori cut I think is honestly pretty solid. And I think it's a really fun sort of groove to send the record out on. I think that Familiar follows the energy of Vacay also fantastically. I think It's You is a fun little jam earlier in the record where there's some real sensuality and passion felt that I think helps sort of cement some love in the early stretch of this record pretty fucking well. I really like this album, you know, as somebody who's thought Aminé has been pretty consistent, honestly, and hasn't had a record where I haven't loved at least a handful of the songs. Aminé is one of those artists that I think always drops a record that I at least have a lot of songs that I love from it, and this is no exception. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I really dig the vibes of this. As somebody who loved the directions that parts of like the last Childish Gambino record went as far as like embracing dance and stuff, part of me would love to see more funk, but that's just because I'm a funky kind of guy.
Just as constant as the air I breathe.
I picked a really good time to get into Kali Uchis, I think, because she's on a creative renaissance, dropping album after album after album over the last handful of years, Red Moon and Venus being the one that was my initial real excursion into her music outside of the select songs and features I'd heard from her, and I think that its follow-up, Orquídeas, was an even stronger album, and I went into this newest one sincerely on a high, and I think that this album still retains a lot of the heart, especially of Orquídeas. I think that like the deep passion and love is still felt, especially on some of the truly soaring grand moments like on For You, a song that I think brings in some icy synth production that I think helps paint this song in a different vibe than a lot of the record. I think is a nice moment when it comes in. You know, a lot of this record has like a very classic feel in its sonic palette in a way that is a little bit different than the last couple of records too, which I also really like to see her branch out even more. Like, It's Just Us and The Swing on All I Can Say are like classic pop. And I think that she handles those genres really strongly, honestly. I think All I Can Say is like a vintage feeling bop. And I love how in love she sounds on that song. It kind of feels like the mission statement of sorts, because it's sort of the sentiment shared on the grand opener Heaven is a Home. And even when the sort of mood pivots into other realms, like on the sort of showcasing of the depth of their or the maybe like the other side of their love, like on Lose My Cool, and same on the conflict of Territorial. Those moments also act as nice sort of emotional pivots away from some of the parts where the album is really deep in love between this sort of A and B couple. I will say, for all of the love I do have for a lot of the songs here, and I think that it is a solid album, I don't think I like it as much as Orchideus. I like the overall just sonic palette of that album a lot. I've contemplated buying it on vinyl a couple of times, because I just think it has a lot of really good, strong pop songs that have a nice ebb and flow of sorts. I like the energy of this project, but I feel like there's a couple stretches where it feels like it's swept up in itself, so to speak. Some of the songs don't necessarily start to sound samey, because the album does do some really nice pivots, but the same kind of tempo just kind of lulls the record into itself. But again, if we're talking comparatively, I think that I like this just a step below her last album. But I still think it's solid. And I think that if you like what Callie's doing, I think that this is another great piece of her discography. I just don't know if I'm going to come back to it as much as really her last couple of records. But I do like this. I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. Super solid.
Came for it, what you got? I never learned to skateboard, but I learned to grind. So my niggas had to make more, so they turned to crime. When
Unlike Callie Uchis, I knew Mike was a semi-prolific rapper, so I wasn't wholly shocked that he was dropping something else. I didn't expect it to be another Tony Seltzer collab with Pinball 2, but I think that this meeting of the minds, honestly, is a little bit more of a captivating experience than the first Pinball, honestly. I like the first Pinball, but then when I got a flavor of, like, what feels more like a Mike project in retrospect, I kind of just ended up liking it more than the first Pinball. But I think that, like, there's more to this. There's a bit more of an interesting ebb and flow. Some of the smaller songs feel more like interesting dives back into familiarity at some points that I think make for a more fun experience. Like Belt and Sucka Free between Money and Power and Prezi is sort of like a good showcasing of the strengths of that in effect. The chopped up instrumentals on like Money and Power and Prezi go off. And I think that like Money and Power has like a really cool sort of like flip into that sort of lower key realm. But I think that like it's got a hook to it that I think is also really catchy and effective. And there's a couple songs like that on here that like have some solid hooks to them. Like What You Came For, Lunchbox's edition on Dolomite's also pretty solid too. And some of the mellower moments also create for that same sort of familiarity, but in a different sort of breath. Like on Angsty or on one of the handful of solid collaborations, Shaq and Kobe, another one with Neonte, who I think pairs really well with Mike's delivery. I think the two have some chemistry on that track, and I think that beat is all vibes. I also like Jumanji with Earl. I think that's another showcasing of like the growth and chemistry between Mike and Tony to some degree. I think that the beat on that song is more interesting than like most of Pinball 1. By the way, I think that this is still a really solid collaboration between these two that I think I like at least a step better than Pinball. I don't know if I like it as much as Showbiz, but I do think this is a more interesting record, by the by, and I think that if you like Mike, you're probably gonna like this. I'm gonna be giving this a 7 out of 10. It's really fucking solid.
Maybe my introduction into Belgian drone jazz offshoot group Neptunian Maximalism's 2020 sophomore outing Eon wasn't the best entry point for me into the group, because that album felt like one dense with ideas and an approach that gave a balance to some whirlwind musicality and some overwrite gargantuan scale. The approach on this new album, Le Sacre du Soleil, Invaincu is one that focuses more on that scale and less on creating this dynamic, more engaging experience. It's also leaner than Eons by about an hour, but I would say, personally, after leaving this album in the rear view, I would much rather have an album's worth of material if it meant the band were gonna do more with that time than what they do on here. While I don't hate the sounds on this album, and I think that, like, when that scale I sort of really adored about Eons comes into fray, it can really still feel as immense as ever. I also like the ambient approach that a lot of this record does take. Similarly to an album I love from last year, the Blood Incantation album. It is an album that is made up of these 3 large suites that are meant to take the listener through Dusk, Arcana, and Dawn, through the avenues of, you know, horns coming in to enrich the sounds, these large, big guitar chords ringing out, all in this reverb-coated atmosphere, which I really enjoy by and large, especially upon my first couple of listens. It does a good job at putting the listener in this empty space and letting them feel this underlying dread beneath some of the building crescendos that happen throughout some of these long burn tracks. They especially come to head on, like, the third part of the Dusk Suite, where there's just this lurching stomp that hits the listener with this overall intensity that I think that suite builds to with glorious splendor. I even love how that gives away to the eerie dream chord stretch, where all of that intensity feels like it's sort of fizzling away as the sun starts to set, and really acts as one of the bigger highlights for the record to me personally. You know, it almost has this Western-esque feel to the sounds as they drone on and fly into the horizons. I even get a taste of what I was really clamoring for with some of that sort of abstract, less drone-focused approach through the end of the Arcana stretch. The last part of that kind of gives me that sort of jittery, unnerving musicality that I liked about parts of Eons, and I think is this nice moment for the band to kind of, like, lock in and create this sort of, like, really maddening portion of the album that I think shines. I don't even hate the Dawn stretch as much as I think that that's sort of an emboldening of, in parts of the Arcana stretch emboldens, of these longer stretches that are more focused on drone and scale and less on adapting ideas, which aren't necessarily bad, but I feel like if they were going to take this kind of approach, some of those stretches could have more in a production sense. You know, it doesn't feel quite like a Sun album if I were to give, like, a drone comparison to a group that I think can use production to carry the listener through their very, you know, dense, guitar-driven, abstract ideas. But I think what sets them apart and down to some degree are the moments where some of the other accompaniment comes in and adds to it. Like I already mentioned in that part of Dusk stretch, but the Dawn stretch's finale opens with this this woodwind instrument just sort of like creating the sun as it's rising, and I think it creates a good sort of like last big monolith for the listener to listen through, but it feels like it's the road to it was so inconsistently engaging. I'm a big fan of ambient music. You know, I've talked about and praised a lot of ambient music in the past, and I love when a band can take these, you know, more chord-driven and atmosphere-building approaches and making an album out of it. But there's stretches of this album that I think upon re-listens just left me a lot more dry than I was hoping, especially considering some of the mastery happening on Eons. I think there's still a handful of highlights on the stretches of this, and I think that even the moments that I don't like as much upon revisits aren't necessarily bad, but if I'm comparing them to like other things of their ilk, they're just not quite as astounding to me or as, you know, awe-giving as some bands in this scene can sort of do. I respect the approach, though, and I see what they're doing. I see the vision. I just don't think that the execution was as good as maybe their last album when it came to creating an album-like experience. I think that if you like drone metal, if you like albums that really test the listener's patience or put the listener in a world of sorts, in this instance, sort of like a passing through the night, so to speak, you may find some things to enjoy out of this as well. This isn't going to be anywhere amongst my favorites or least favorites of the year, like I maybe was hoping would, at least in the favorite sort of sense. But I'm still walking away giving this a 7. It's a solid approach that I think shines when it does, but also falters when I feel like it shouldn't. When I decided I was going to listen to the newest Machine Head record, even if it's been a long time since I really spun any of their music, I thought I had still stayed up to date on their discography. Knowing that this is the second in seemingly a record of this style that they're maybe embracing in a new era, I'm a little shocked, but also, like, further reminded why I don't respin this band or get nostalgic for their sounds, even if I have still my favorite album of theirs on vinyl. And it's because this sound of metal that I would have thought they would have left behind in lieu of, like, newer styles of production sounds even more, like, bad all these years later. Like, this sounds like a Machine Head record through and through. It very much feels like it's emulating the production and sounds of the era that, like, I really loved from them in the past. But even, like, the moments where they're supposed to, like, go bold and bigger, like on choruses of tracks like Atomic Revelations or These Scars Won't Define Us, they feel so buried in a production that feels like it's meant to just keep everything in this homogenized brick. Which I feel like some bands maybe try to still adapt today, like your Killswitch Engages. But even the records that they do now, that are trying to, like, emulate this sound, do so with a little more tactfulness and fullness and nuance than the bare bones aggression that's felt throughout this new album, Unatoned. On top of that, whoever their new drummer is now is not creating the interesting kind of drum lines that, like, they were doing during the era that this is trying to emulate, along with having a lack of definition across the sounds of the band that those albums had that just feels lost on this. It feels like a carbon copy of, like, a version of a band that I really enjoyed. You would think with, like, the Pantera guitar worship on a song like Unbound, that shit would sound razor sharp. But it's like you dulled the razor for, like, 20 years and am trying to cut through paper with the dullest knife imaginable. All of it sounds heavy, but none of it feels heavy, if that makes any sense. And that's really the biggest issue I have with this, on top of a lack of dynamics in general. Like, there's no real softness. You know, even the songs that try to be soft, like Bone Scraper, are washed away in this ambiguous gray that feels even more buried when the heavier moments sort of come into the fray. This almost to me is worse than them trying to tap into, like, the new metal stuff that they were trying to do in the late 90s. This is just, like, the worst kind of thing a band like this could do, and I really think that this thing is just not good. It honestly sucks a whole hell of a lot. I'm giving it a 2 out of 10.
I'm down to bottle shit up, but I guess it got me today. I seen the cat break a vase and I broke my bottle the same. Look,
I closed this month with the new Aesop Rock, and I know, earlier in the video, I gassed up the new Billy Woods a lot, and I might have spoiled my thoughts on it in the hierarchy of hip-hop comparatively with this, but this album is still really, really fucking good. I've been highly anticipating this idea of this supermarket in outer space. I had no idea what the fuck it was going to actually culminate to in the grand hierarchy of how Ace constructs his records. But on the other side, it's another banger, man. You guys already know, I literally just talked about it like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago almost at this point. I love the stretch Aesop Rock has been on. I think he's been just one-upping himself time and time and time again. The 2020s have just been a really great moment of an era of growth for one of my favorite rappers, and I'm absolutely here for it. I think that he's really found a sonic palette that works well with his obtuse bar spinning and storytelling. It's given an avenue to find his bars more digestible. I've been getting my coworkers that love hip-hop into Aesop Rock because I think he is well worth people that appreciate the art of rap and may not know of him because of that barrier like that, but like they should. And I think that like this is another really good direction for him to carry his audience through. I think that he brings you into that world very directly, but I think he goes into some really cosmic realms that I think land just as effectively as the abrasiveness. I love the immediacy of Secret Knock. I think that it rivals Mystery Fish for like stage setting, but in like an inverse sense, because Mystery Fish kind of builds a little bit, but I think that like that gives way to a really cool stretch. Also, I think that Checkers is a really great single. I think that it showcases the more low-key funk realms that I love to see Aesop produce. The bass on that song is sick as fuck, man. And that kind of groove really feels like the heart of some of this album's other highlights, like the collaboration with Arm & Hammer, 1010 Wins, a three-piece that I absolutely love seeing come together. Again, considering what I just said about Billy Woods. It's also a part of the other three-piece on the back end that I fucking love with Charlie Horse. It's cool to see him come together with Homeboy Sandman, but like, when he and Lupe did that Pumpkin Seed single, I didn't expect them to really come together that soon again. They are two artists of a similar ilk that I love, and I think that this is an awesome, like, pseudo-pivot for, like, where Zero Dark 30 would sit, as far as having some braggadocio, but in, like, such an Aesop way. It's idiosyncratic, but, like, in the best way. There's also some really good moments of catchiness, too. Like, I was expecting Open Mike Eagle to come together well with Aesop. They've worked together in the past, but, like, I love his hook on So Be It. And I think that that's a really strong song. It should be a single at some point, especially considering Mike is going to be dropping an album soon that I'm also excited about. The Red Phone is also really, really catchy. I love Homeboy Sandman's part of the hook. He crops up a couple of times as like a piece of this store, and I love seeing it happen. There's also like a paranoia and sort of like unease to parts of this that also sit within some of the realms Aesop's been toying in, like on Costco and on Snail Zero, another one of the niche personal tales where Aesop talks about a snail infestation he had. I also love that sort of niche reflection on a song like John Something, a slice of his childhood, a la songs like Blood Sandwich and 100 Feet Tall, where he talks about this dude that came into town named John Something. It kind of also kind of feels like the rando that comes in as you're working a retail shift. There's a lot of this. As somebody who's worked retail for a long time, I sort of like felt while spinning this, especially on respinning this. It'll be a while before I put it in the context of the discography, because like what happened with ITS, I'll just sit with Aesop for a while and see where his records really resonate with me. As somebody who really loves the avenues of deconstruction of labor, I really like that aspect of it, and there's other deviations within this where Ace sort of pivots into other realms while also kind of keeping it on brand that I think also come together harmoniously, a la the other singles Send Help or Ice Sold Here. I absolutely adore this, and I'm giving it a 9. It's really fucking good. If you like Aesop Rock, it's absolutely up your alley, and this shit rips. And those are my thoughts on the records I spun. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is there an album I haven't spun yet from this year that you'd like for me to talk about in this segment? Leave all those thoughts in the comments down below. Again, if you liked it, make sure that you give it a like, and if you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I've got going on. I'm aiming to have what was supposed to be the Saturday special starting a couple of weeks ago, dropping this weekend, so hopefully you're excited for that, but I'm going to go in the meantime. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.